Thank you, dear friends, respected Professor Sudarshan, dear and respected my friend Frederick. Is it okay? I can have 10 minutes or so? So with your generosity and our journey together into this very inviting field, and Frederick has already invited us in a critical way to think about these terms of conversation as it relates to human condition. To warm up our journey, and let us also realize that all these terms relate to the challenge of life, isn't it? Governmentality, culture, and capability. So let us begin with this line of poem by a very inviting poet named Jayanta Mohapatra, who writes the following: "My life is something else. How can I live with the birds who cannot sing, and with the wind that had lost its voice, staring simply at those fabulous holy oil lamps that perform their ritual in the musty depths of life? Their light makes no sense to me." With all these fellow travelers that we have traveled with Frederick, Foucault, Nussbaum, and theories of culture like, for example, Axel Honneth. I'm sure Frederick would have liked to bring Honneth to our journey here. They all point to the sense of loss and grief when is a career of life, but when one is not living one's life. Governmentality, the dynamics of power as it has unfolded through state, for example, has been a regime of violence and violation. And then that creates the condition for realization of capability, beginning with functioning and capability in the sense that Sen and Nussbaum would say. But of course, we need to interrogate, deepen, and realize it further. It is in this journey, let us then begin with the challenge of governmentality. So I would seek your indulgence to connect to Frederick on these three terms very briefly, including elaborating the whole fascinating field of culture. But beginning with governmentality, governmentality is the field of power, but governmentality also is related to another very critical dimension of what can be called as self-government. Foucault was sensitive to explore this, though in his dominant conceptualization of governmentality, this challenge of self-government didn't figure too much. But in his posthumous work, Hermeneutics of the Subject, Foucault offers us a very profound challenge. He is saying that when we are talking of being a subject, let us be critically aware that being a subject is not just following the path of subjectivity offered by state. So, subject here is not just offered by state on the one hand, or not just being subjected to. It is in that space the notion of subject and power is not just subject is subjected to, but subject as a creative force that is hinted at by Gandhi, but also by Alain Touraine, a fellow worker of Foucault in the same French soil of creative imagination. For Touraine, to be a subject is to have the capacity to say no. No to power, And for Foucault, for Turin, subjectivation lies in capacity to say no to fundamentalism, market fundamentalism, and communitarian fundamentalism. So therefore, this whole logic of governmentality via the challenge of self-government, via this complex call of subjectivation, it can be cultivated further with dialogue like Turin, but also Gandhi. In talking about government, then, as you know, Gandhi's great contribution to governmentality was a profound critique of centralized state. And therefore, that whole logic of a different reality of power, so that is quite central. But with Gandhi and Foucault, very quickly, let us also understand the challenge of epistemology. As you know, that Foucault brought the question of the way we think, and Frederick challenged us for the need for changing perspective. It is in that spirit of changing perspective and multi-perspectivality, so we can cultivate further a path of freedom which Gandhi really cultivated. Gandhi, at one point, he has written the following. I will just write this paragraph. When you read this one line, he is saying, my Swadavada is not Swadavada of the learned. You know, Swadavada and Anekantavada, these are two very pregnant and deep ways of thinking and being coming from the Jaina tradition. It means the many-sided approach to truth. And as a profound challenge that Frederick has said, that how do we go beyond a notion of command, 10 commandment of Bible, 10 commandment of Nussbaum. So therefore it requires a deep multi-perspectivality. And Gandhi cultivated that Anekantavada. And today we need to cultivate an Anekanta Patha. But what Gandhi is saying, my Anekantavada is not of the learned. It is peculiarly my own. I cannot engage in a debate with them. It had been my experience that I am always true from my point of view, and I am often wrong from the point of view of the honest critic. And I know that we are both right from our respective point of view. And so it's a very complex argument. It is not just relativism. So very quickly, we need to link epistemology and politics, and a very way in which we can think differently, be differently with this path of multi-valued logic. And of course, time being short, but we also need to link governmentality of what I would like to call as law and dharma. And of course, the government in modernity is linked to law. But very briefly, dear friends, the notion of law, it is linked to right, R-I-G-H-T, isn't it? But that right, when it becomes cross-culturally open, it is not divorced from R-I-T-E, isn't it? And that right and R-I-T-E, the way of being, and of course there is a very important work from Indian tradition and Chinese tradition, on democracy. And that right and right does implicate good or lack of good, isn't it? But in Western political tradition, both in Kant and Habermas and Rawls, there is an opposition between right and good. So we need not be prisoner of that. At the same time, dear friends, we can extend these terms of conversation to God, G-O-D, and also evil. Evil as something that forces which really does not want us to realize. This is what Axel Honneth calls disrespect. Disrespect is those forces of violence which obstruct our capability for realization. Therefore, culture is those processes. Culture is not just routine. Culture, it is not just uncritical right, R-I-T-E, ritualism. Culture is those processes which facilitates our journey of realization. self-realization, co-realization. It is in this sense, of course, Frederick has been deeply interested in culture in his book, and that notion of culture as that kind of a potential to be different can be further cultivated by looking at the distinction between culture as property and culture as inspiration. That inspiration can be linked to imagination, even in the sense of Nussbaum. My friend and teacher from Odisha, Chittaranjan Das, makes this very important distinction between culture as property and culture as inspiration. But where does inspiration come from? If we look at, inspiration comes from that journey of togetherness, including struggling with the inability to come together. And that finally brings us very quickly to capability. And now, along with many difficulties that Frederick has invited us to ponder, some of these further linked difficulties are, for example, not really linking creativity to capability. Though in Nussbaum, to be fair to her, because as she is a student of philosophy and poetry, she has also written a book called Poetic Justice, Now the difficulty is that model of the agent coming from her study of poetics does not fully manifest in her subject on capability. So now the plea is, how do we have a concept of capability where the notion of transcendence, that Nussbaum does talk about transcendence. So, but in trying to bring Aristotle and Kant, now in both Aristotle and Kant, transcendence is of a particular kind. But we need not be imprisoned within that narrow concept of transcendence. Coming to Amartya Sen, and of course, Amartya Sen is also another person who is trying to bring Kant and Aristotle, But some profound limits of that model, again very quickly I would like to submit, is that this whole Aristotelian Kantian model of man, techno-practitioner, that notion of the techno-practitioner must be deepened and opened. And here I would have a much more encompassing view of the human, autonomous as well as interrelated. Then the whole notion of subject and agent, but I think the two other themes that I would like to invite you to think about: capability as model of human development, along with the capability to listen, for example. The whole discourse of human development has been thought of in a mainly modernistic and Eurocentric way. For example, political empowerment and economic development. Now, who are human beings? I think the being human is intimately connected with nature, isn't it? Can we be human without nature? At the same time, certain notion of transcendence is implicated in our being human. Think of in Indian tradition, as well as in both science and Indian tradition, this very fundamental realization is to be human is to be Pancha Mahabhuta, this earth, air, water, fire and akasha. In any discourse of human development, have you heard about any discourse about, earth, air, water? But if you come to Chipko movement, for example, which I studied nearly 30 years ago, there the slogan is, Kya hai jangal ka upkar, mitti pani o bayar. What is the benefit of a forest? Is mitti, soil, pani, water and air. But in discourse of human development then, of course today with climate change and everything it is coming, but have we ever asked what does it mean to be human, a human which can be water? And so this is another challenge for the capability and approach and human development. Another very important challenge coming from our rooted conversation is the discourse of Purusartha and human development. As you know, if capability deals with the human, that what does it mean to human in Indian tradition, it is linked to Purusartha, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. And it is possible to bring that in conversation. But not only that, we also need to invite another fundamental category, the whole notion of guna, which can be translated as orientation or proclivities, sattva, raja, tama. So I think in the plea for bringing culture to capability, once we open it up, for example, capability. Now the capability to be, if we bring a sattvic perspective, the sattva, a sense of truth and sense of equanimity, it would be of a particular kind. Rajasic, with a dominant to dominate, and tamasic. And if you play these categories, you look at contemporary Indian predicament, both politics and policy. It really opens up. So finally, about happiness, I think, Frederick also was mentioning about the important challenge of happiness, which is a concern with the Aristotelian tradition. And as you know, today, development is also not only GDP, but gross national happiness. I was in Bhutan, and the difficulty of that concept, while we should not, uncritically valorize gross national happiness, that discourse, but nonetheless, the whole idea of happiness and the limits of that, and if we can link it to ananda. So again, here culture plays a very important role in opening up our conversations. Thank you for your
That's